Hello, welcome everybody. This is going to be the fourth session on the Social Determinants of Health course, and today I'm going to talk about social networks. Social networks is probably my favorite topic. It's the area where I've worked in for the very longest time. It's the one that I think was most personally important to me when we started our work on social determinants, and I'm even going to show you some of my dissertation work, which helped to shape this field. So in part one, I'm going to talk about the theory and the history and some about the measures. In part, I'm going to just give you some, show you some of the PowerPoints with lists of measures for you to take home and think about. In the second part, I'm going to show you some of the empirical associations between social networks and different kinds of health outcomes. And in the very last part, we're going to talk about looking at social networks, especially in low and middle income countries, with several very important studies being currently done in South Africa and Africa generally, and covering both areas of observational studies as well as trying to figure out about interventions and how to design interventions better using social network theory. So let me show you the very first slide, and this actually is the egg that I would say has changed my life. This is a social network model. It was created by an anthropologist who did a great deal of qualitative work in understanding friends of friends. And he wrote this book in 1970s called Friends of Friends, and it was about the bonds that tied people together. And in this book, he has this egg in which he shows the importance of an array of different kinds of relationships. And I want to go through it in some detail because it illustrates almost everything that's important about social networks. So in the very center of the circle, you'll see the individual. And what Jeremy Boissevin says is that people are surrounded by a series of people who go from being very intimate to very extended. So in the beginning is a personal cell. If you can think about who's in that cell, it's the people who are closest to you in your life. And one of the things that's really important about this network model, and which we'll see coming and going, is that when anthropologists started to study social networks, they realized that they should not make assumptions about whether intimacy was related to kinship or not. That before that, people used to study kin relationships and other relationships. But networks are agnostic about that. They say, well, who's in this personal cell might be a kin member or might not. Let's not be prescriptive about this. Let's actually ask people who is in their network, and then figure out whether they're family or not, or who they are, what their characteristics are. And this allows us to get a much broader network model. So in this personal cell are people who are most intimate in your life, and then you start to move out, and there's another intimate zone A of people who are maybe not the closest people in your life, but people who you are still very, very close to. And then you move out into intimate zone B, which is filled with people who I think of as probably your friends, or coworkers who you're really friends with, or people in your neighborhood who you know pretty well. And then we move out to a very extended zone. And this is the one that is interesting in social networks, because this affective zone, as well as the nominal and the extended zone, make up what we often call weak ties. That is, people who we don't know very well. But it turns out that these weak ties are very important for getting a number of things done. So if we think of people in this affective zone, you think of people who maybe if you go to the grocery store, it's the person who owns the grocery store, whether it's people who help you fix your car, or teachers who teach your kids, people who help you get stuff done, but they're not intimate. You wouldn't say they're friends, but they're people who help you get things done. And then in this nominal zone are people who you know, like maybe you know their name, but you don't know them well. But you may know them because they live in your village, or they live in your neighborhood, or they live in your apartment building. And you know that you could ask them for a cup of sugar, but you couldn't ask them for a lot of money. You know that you could ask them to do a favor, but not a big favor. And then there are people in this extended zone who you actually don't know at all by name, but you know them because you pass them in the street every day. You know them because they're working in a place where you always go to shop for groceries, or you always go to the same vegetable market and you know the person, but you don't actually know their name, but you do know them. So people in these effective and nominal and extended zones form weak ties, and people in the intimate zones form much more intimate ties. And almost all the evidence we have linking social networks to health suggests that you need some people in many of these zones, that it isn't enough to have one person who's very intimate with you and no other contacts, and it isn't enough to have only weak ties. And to give you an illustration of the weak ties for a minute, people have studied how people get jobs and found that most often you find out about jobs from weak ties, because they actually have access to new sources of information that you don't have. So people in your intimate zone all know the same stuff you know. So they don't actually provide you information to a new job possibility or even a new apartment or housing. But people in these extended ties, because they're friends of friends of friends, actually have different kinds of information. So this network model is one that I want you to hold in your head throughout the whole talk. And what we're going to do, and what network analysis does, is try to assess who is in these zones and the characteristics of people in these zones. And that allows you to understand the structure and the function of networks. So now I'm going to read you one very wordy quote from Emil Durkheim. So Emil Durkheim was, one of the founders of sociology, one of the people who most thought about the importance of social integration, and one of, for me, the heroes of looking at issues related to social integration and networks and social cohesion, and understanding that it's the social context that shapes so many of our behaviors. So let me read this and then we'll break it down a little bit. So what Durkheim said in Suicide is that individuals making up a society change from year to year. The number of suicides itself does not change. So the suicide rate in a country, for instance, stays the same, even though people come and go. And then he says the population of Paris renews itself very rapidly, yet the share of Paris in the total number of French suicides remains practically same. So the causes which fix the contingent of voluntary deaths for a given society, or one part of it then, must be independent of individuals, since they retain the same intensity no matter what particular persons they operate on. So this is very complicated, but let's think of it, particularly with regard to suicide, in the way that you might think about the importance of social integration at a community level. So suicide, in some sense, is the most personal act that an individual can do. At some level, we think it has nothing to do with anything social. It's a completely individual characteristic. And what he says was, well, if it were really just an individual characteristic, then the rate of Paris in suicide rates would be the same as every place else. There would be nothing special about Paris or a city or a community because it's a completely individual act. The fact that this is not an individual act, that suicide is patterned across societies and groups, says that it's something about the group which actually drives these suicide rates. So that, again, for me, was one of the most important things that we think about when we think about the ways in which social networks can influence behaviors and health. So here's the little egg shape, not as elegant as the one that Boissevin did, but I want to show you about the structure. So when we look at social networks, what we're looking at is the web of social relationships or ties that surround us. And it's very important, if you take nothing else away from this talk, I would like you to remember the difference between social networks, social support, and social capital, all of which I will talk to you about. So networks are structures that surround individuals. They're not about just one person. They're about what's the network like? Is it large? Is it small? Do people all live close together? Do they live far apart? Do they see each other all the time? How many people in networks, like in your network, if you think about it, know each other? Are they really dense? Like, is your network filled with people where everybody knows each other? Or are they not very dense and actually extend out to very many people? How reciprocal are relationships in your network? If you help people, do they help you? Is reciprocity a characteristic of this network or not? So when we look at social networks, and we'll talk about these measures some more, we are looking at the kinds of measures that describe the network. They don't describe individuals. They describe the structure of networks. And here is a very complicated model, but I wanted to embed social networks here in the rest of social and psychological factors. So networks exist at kind of this mezzo level. It's the second column in this picture. And they are shaped. Networks don't just pop up randomly, of course. They are shaped by social and other structural conditions. They're shaped by the culture we live in, by what's normative. They're shaped by socioeconomic factors, how much inequality there is, how much conflict, how much discrimination there is. They're described and characterized by geographic features of neighborhoods, of whether you live in an urban area or a rural area. And of course, social change itself shapes networks and is maybe the largest factor that shapes networks. So as societies change, as they become more urbanized, networks change very profoundly. In countries exposed to war and civil unrest, also networks change in very important ways. And in economic recessions, networks may change. So there are social and economic factors and political factors that shape networks. And the networks you can think of as structure, that is, how would you describe the network, and activation, how often do people see them? And then why might these networks influence health? Well, it turns out that once you start thinking about this, they could do it for any number of reasons. So here are just some of them. One of them, the one that we most often think of, is social support. So we think networks are important because one of the functions of networks is to provide social support. And social support can be instrumental or financial. That is, you could help somebody get to a store or buy groceries. It can be informational because you tell a person, oh, I think you're really sick, you should go to a doctor, or something like that. Appraisal. Think of appraisal support as you may not feel very well, your heart hurts, your legs are very achy, and you can ask somebody, like, what do you think? Do you think I'm sick? Do you think I have a problem or not? And then, of course, there's just emotional support. So you think of somebody who has a very serious problem, maybe they have a very big loss in their family, and just providing emotional support, just being there, is very important. So social support is one of the reasons that networks are important, but it's not the only one. So here are some others. Access to resources and material goods. As I said, with weak ties, people in networks, strong networks, have better times finding jobs. They find housing. They get access to good health care. They get referrals and institutional contacts. So we can think of access to resources and material goods as one of the important functions of networks. Social engagement turns out to be another one. So by being in a network, it almost means you need to get up in the day and take care of somebody. You need to live in a world with other people. That turns out to be really good for your brain. So cognitive exercise is very important, and I'll show you some data on that. It reinforces meaningful roles. It says, I'm a parent, I'm a partner, I'm a child, I'm a really good teacher, I'm a good worker. So it means that you're part of a society. I'm a good neighbor. And fourth, it influences what your behaviors are. And these can be either good or bad, right? So networks have a lot of social influence. They can actually promote smoking. They can promote all kinds of sexual activity. They can also help and be health promoting. But attitudes and norms about different kinds of behaviors is one of the very important things that networks do. And again, I just want to emphasize that these can be either health or risky behaviors. If you live in a network that's in which many people smoke or use illicit drugs, the odds of you using illicit drugs or smoking are much higher because you're influenced by the people around you. So to go one more pathway down, how might these behavioral mechanisms then translate into different kinds of pathways which could influence health? Well, one of them is the psychobiological pathway. It can be stressful or stress-reducing. There are lots of psychophysiologic pathways that happen as a result of these kinds of stress pathways. There are also behavioral pathways. As I said, you might smoke more. You might drink more alcohol. Your diet might be either very good or very bad. Networks can promote exercise or treatment adherence. And then there are a lot of psychological pathways, including ones that make you feel self-efficacious or cope well with disease. So this is an overall conceptual model of how social networks might influence health. So now I want to talk a little bit about social support so you understand the difference between social networks and social support. So social network measures describe the structure of a network. Social support is a function of social networks. And as I said before, it's often measured in multiple ways: emotional, help with a problem; instrumental, help getting tasks done; financial, economic support; appraisal, help evaluating situations. And also, these questions are often asked in a number of different ways, like, is anybody available to help with these things? Is it enough? Is it adequate? And who provides? How many people provide this kind of support? So that's about social support. So what is social capital? There is a huge controversy about how we measure social capital. Some people say that social networks are social capital and that they're completely conflated like this. I think that's not very helpful, so I try to distinguish these things. So I think of social capital as the sum of resources, actual or virtual, that accrue to an individual or a group by virtue of possessing a durable social network. So this is a definition by Bourdieu, a very well-known French sociologist who worked a lot on this. And the idea is that social capital facilitates actions of individuals, and the investment in social relationships is expected to give a return in a marketplace, which is why the word capital is there. So if you think of living in a really strong, cohesive network, if you live in a house and you're exposed to a storm or a flood and your barn is destroyed or your house is destroyed, your network may come together and help you build a new house. And they do this because you belong in this network and everybody understands that they help each other. So this creation of social capital facilitates different kinds of returns. So I think of social capital as a resource that flows through networks. Can social capital be harmful? You know, we often think of social capital as just being a total good. Well, how can something that facilitates collective action for mutual benefit be bad? Well, there's some evidence that it can be coercive. If you belong to a gang, for instance, that does really bad things, and you're expected to do that and participate, you could feel very coerced into doing something that could be quite harmful. There's some evidence by social scientist Alejandro Portes, who talks about the fact that fragile networks, that is, for instance, recent migrants who have very limited resources but want to keep taking in all their family as they come, can sometimes get overwhelmed. The idea is it can sink the ship, that if you keep taking care of everybody in a network that doesn't have a lot of resources, you can actually sink the boat entirely. We could think that networks or capital could inhibit free expression. So often people who are outliers, who don't quite feel like they fit in the network, people who dress differently or have different norms or want to do different things, can feel very inhibited and closed in. And finally, they can distribute resources to a few people, not to everybody. So it's important to think critically about these things. And when you're doing studies in this area, it's worthwhile thinking about, well, how might this work? Like, let's think through how are the ways in which networks or social capital or social support actually work in my situation? What am I really interested in? And sort of go through that process. So here are a bunch of measures, and I'm actually putting these up so that you can take them home and look at them, not because I actually think that you're going to look at this whole thing. This is a slide that comes from a meta-analysis of social relationships and mortality. And in this meta-analysis, they looked at 148 studies looking at the relationship between social ties and mortality, and concluded that in almost all cases, social networks were very strong predictors of mortality. And these are the kinds of measures that they talked about. So they have functional measures in terms of support received, perceptions of support, feelings of loneliness, structural kinds of things, networks, integration, social isolation, and things that are combined. This is just to show you there's a large world out there. This is another slide that's impossible to really go through in this amount of time, but is in a chapter that we're doing on social epidemiology on the characteristics of networks. And what I want you to understand from this slide is that these are measures of the network. None of these are measures of an individual. So to give you a few examples, the first one is reachability. How long does it take for me to reach somebody who I don't know but lives on the other side of my village? 6 degrees of separation. How many people do I need to go to? What's the average path length? The average of the shortest path. How long does it get me to a distant person? If we looked at density, for instance, sort of down in the middle there, is what are the percent of ties that exist relative to all possible ties? That is, how many people know each other? And bridging talks about the existence of a path between one node and the other. So often you have two sets of networks that are relatively isolated from each other, but there's one person who's a bridge. Now, sometimes those bridges create really healthy dynamics, like they can help everybody in this area find a job. If one of these networks, however, has a lot of sexually transmitted diseases, or any kind of infectious person-to-person disease, this bridge person actually can spread it to everybody in the other network. So knowing that there are bridges is very important in understanding the spread of different kinds of things. So these are characteristics of social networks. And here again is just for you to be able to look at, because there are a lot of sophisticated ways to measure social networks now. There are a lot of programs that assess these. This is a slide that actually tells you all the new programs that you can use for measuring and assessing the structure of social networks. And these are just more of them. This is really just for your own use, not for us to talk about or understand at this point.